Maybe you just give a thumbs up since everybody's on mute. If you can see it, we're good to go. All right. So my name is Alli Brown. I'm the Community Programs Coordinator at Missouri Botanical Garden. I started at the garden in July of 2018. So I'm almost at 2 full years here in my position. In my focus, I work on the education team with Andrea. And my focus is on invasive plant species, native plant species, biodiversity in general. So I do a lot of classes and things like this, generally in person, not on online, but this is my first try doing a little webinar style presentation. So bear with me in case things get a little fuzzy. Also, I do have 2 dogs, so if they start barking in the background, just disregard them. But today we're going to talk about invasive plants. So we're going to learn a little bit about how they impact us, our environment, economy, and our human health. We're also going to learn to identify some invasive plants that you might be seeing popping up in your backyard, and also how you can get rid of those. So just to give you a little kind of background or thinking about why this is important or why we need to worry about invasive plant species, I pulled up some statistics because I really like numbers and I think it helps put things in perspective. But did you know that in Illinois, 95.9% of all of the land in Illinois is privately owned, which is 35.3 million acres. Also in Missouri, 93% of all the land in Missouri is privately owned, and that's 42.6 million acres. And so if you have a hard time visualizing how large an acre is, it's a football field if you get rid of the end zone. So if you think of that, 42.6 million of those is how much land in Missouri is privately owned. So a lot of times when we're talking about invasive plant species, people think, oh, well, it's MDC's job to get rid of the invasive plants, or it's U.S. Forest Service needs to manage our forests better to get rid of invasive plants, but it also starts in our own backyards because, like I said, we own 93% of that land, so it's our responsibility too. So we're gonna go over what are invasive plants. This might be a phrase you've heard before, it might be brand new. But really an invasive plant is just one that isn't native to our region. So it crossed some kind of boundary to get here. And it's also has negative effects on our economy, our environment, or our human health. And generally they spread pretty aggressively and they can cause major damage. So there are lots of different words that we can use to describe invasive plants. You sometimes hear the word exotic, you might hear the word weed, or invasive. So here are just some different examples of things that I found on the internet talking about these different plants and the way we describe them. And the way we describe plants is actually pretty important. So I want to go over the different terms so that we are all on the same page when thinking about these plants. So an exotic species is just one that doesn't naturally occur in our region. So it was introduced in some way. A weed is just a plant that's growing somewhere where we don't want it to grow. So it's not really a scientific term, it's just this plant was not planted here and it's somehow growing here. Again, an invasive plant species is something that isn't native to our region but has negative effects. An opportunistic native plant is something that is native to our region but spreads aggressively. So a good example of this would be like an eastern red cedar. If you've ever driven down 44 headed out to Shaw Nature Reserve, you see a lot of cedars alongside the roads on 44. It's actually a native plant, but it thrives on disturbed land. So anytime we do construction or really just the earth gets moved around, those seeds can spread and then they get dispersed. A naturalized species is just a non-native species that was introduced but is able to thrive without any intervention from humans, but it doesn't necessarily cause any damage, not detrimental. And then lastly, a noxious weed is a classification of weeds or of plants. So this is actually a legal designation. There's a noxious weed law that states that any of the plants on the list can't be distributed, sold, or grown, propagated. So the list of those plants is at the very bottom of this slide. So that's Canada thistle, teasel, bindweed, Johnson grass, kudzu. Marijuana is on that list because it's an illegal plant that you can't grow. Multiflora rose, musk thistle, purple loosestrife, spotted knapweed, and Scotch thistle.
Alli,
So you might be, yes.
a quick question real quick from the
Mm-hmm.
from the chat. We're talking about privately owned land. Does that include state parks, the garden?
Nope.
What does that include?
The garden would be privately owned because we own it, but as far as state parks, MDC conservation areas, those are all considered public land.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So you might be wondering why some of our most invasive plants aren't on this list, right? So we have these horribly invasive plants like bush honeysuckle is one of the ones that we talk about a lot. Sericea lespedeza is another one that probably should be on here. Maybe the Callery pear or Bradford pear tree, if you've seen those. Those are all really invasive plants, but unfortunately, the Department of Agriculture is the one who has jurisdiction over the noxious weed law. And they're not really in a position to add any more plants to this list. But I will talk about some initiatives that are in the works through the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force later in the presentation about how we might be able to start getting some legislation on these invasive plant species so that we're not able to sell them anymore in nurseries. Okay, so we're going to move on to why are invasive plants a problem and how do they affect me? This is just a good picture I found on the internet. Often when we do ecological restoration, which is just the process of removing invasive plant species and trying to reintroduce native species, it can look like a mess. It can look like a disaster, and people don't always know that the plants that were there before were invasive. So they see maybe fire or they see trees being cut down and they're like, what is happening here? You're getting rid of all these great plants. But it's really important that we communicate with our general public, especially in these public lands, so that they know what's going on. So this is just an example of a sign like that. But we're going to talk about 4 different ways that invasive plants can affect you. So they reduce biodiversity, they have economic impacts, they can threaten our human health, and it can decline our recreational areas. Okay, so I can't really see the chat, but hopefully you can recognize where this picture might be taken. You can take some guesses in the chat if you like, but it should be somewhat familiar to you if you've ever done some hiking. This is at Shaw Nature Reserve, so it's right by the wetland trail. You can see that the trees above have no leaves, but there's this understory level that is completely green and full of leaves. So this is actually bush honeysuckle. You might be familiar with this plant, you might not be. It's one that really has taken over our natural areas in both Missouri and Illinois. And once it gets established, it's really hard to get rid of. So this was taken a few years ago. Since then, they've done a lot of restoration. An AmeriCorps crew actually came through and removed all the bush honeysuckle in this area. And they've been distributing native plant seeds to try to regenerate some of those good native plants. But we want to talk about why reduced biodiversity is a problem. So we were talking about bush honeysuckle, but I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So bush honeysuckle is one of the first plants to get its leaves in the spring. You might have noticed we're a few weeks out now, but the beginning of March, they were the first plants to get little buds, and then those buds turned into leaves. And you might be noticing that just now some of your plants are getting leaves. I know I have some red bud trees in my front yard that I planted, and they're just now starting to leaf out, which is super exciting because I planted them last year and I didn't know if they were going to come back. But they're strong and they're going to start leafing out soon. But using redbud as an example, that's a plant that grows in an understory area in a forested region. So if bush honeysuckle has already been established and it's tall and it's leafing out, it's going to start taking a lot of that energy and the sunlight from the neighboring redbud or other native plants around it, and it's going to actually outcompete those native plants. In addition to just outcompeting by resource, basically stealing resources from other plants. Bush honeysuckle also has an alleliopathic chemical, which just means that it has a toxic chemical that it can secrete from its roots that will inhibit the germination of other seeds surrounding it. So you can picture bush honeysuckle as kind of this web mass that has all these leaves on top, so it's sheltering all the native plants that might be growing in the understory, but it's also kind of doing the same thing in the soil. It's spreading this chemical and it's keeping other plants from growing there. So if those weren't bad enough, the leaves that come off of bush honeysuckle, once they fall into a nearby stream, it can actually change the pH of the water to make it a not favorable place for tadpoles. So it can affect tadpole survival. It can actually kill lots of tadpoles. And then also it makes it a more favorable environment for the common mosquito. So it's having these really negative impacts on not only our native plants, but also our native wildlife as well.
Alli?
Yes.
Quick question from the audience. How long does that toxin last when it
so I don't have a very good answer for this because it actually hasn't been studied all that much, but I do know that it can last in the soil at least a few days after the plant has been removed. So it doesn't stay there forever. It does kind of fade out over time. So let's say you're removing bush honeysuckle in your backyard. You pull the plant out by the roots, you get all the roots out. That soil will probably still need a few more days before you can start putting something in that place where you remove the plant from.
Great, thank you.
And that chemical is also found in the leaves and in the berries too. So it can be detrimental no matter where it is. Any other follow-up questions?
No, thank you. And thanks, Charlie, for the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay. So, and like we know, lots of wildlife depend on very specific native species. So there are a lot of insects and animals that have what we call like keystone species or species that they need to survive. So a good example, of course, is the milkweed for a monarch butterfly. So those plants that these insects and wildlife are depending on are being depleted by these invasive species that have been able to take hold in these areas. So moving on to economic impact, kind of thinking about the bush honeysuckle example about how the redbud tree isn't able to grow next to the bush honeysuckle because of the depletion of the sunlight and the resources, the nutrients from the soil. Another way that can be impactful is that a lot of our logging industry depends on regeneration of oak and hickory forests, and they are not being able to regenerate, right? Those saplings that are going to grow to be our, you know, what we need to harvest in maybe 20 or 30 years aren't going to be there unless we remove the invasive plants that are taking over. So it's inhibiting the regeneration of these trees that we need. So this is a good example, a graph that has, for me, I think it's easier because it has some smiley faces that make it a little bit more easy to understand. But you can see at the beginning where the plant is introduced, it's going to be pretty easy to remove that plant. So let's say a bush honeysuckle starts growing as a little sapling in your backyard right now. It's going to be pretty easy to pull that one out and, you know, go on with your day. Once it's given it some time, so let's say it's 2 years after that one plant has been established. Now it's going to take a little bit more time, and it's going to also have spread a little bit more. And as that graph goes further and further on each axis, it's going to basically exponentially grow to the point where we're no longer able to control that plant. So a good example is along roadsides. You can see lots of invasive bush honeysuckle that's been able to take hold, has been there for years and years. We might be able to control that one spot, but moving further down, it's going to continue to spread. So if we're able to catch new plant introductions at the time that they're introduced, we're going to be much more likely to get rid of them before they become a nuisance. Any questions? Are we good to go?
No, we're good.
All right.
Doing great. I asked if anyone had any bush honeysuckle, and some people do.
Great. Well, we're going to learn how to get rid of it in just a little
Good.
bit. So,
Good.
um, let's see. I also mentioned a little bit about disturbance, but going back to the economic impacts, as we're building roads and new subdivisions and all these things, we're bringing in soil from different places. So if we're building a subdivision in Kirkwood, we might be bringing in soil from a different state or a neighboring community, and we're not sure where that soil came from. So it's possible that weed seeds were distributed in that soil, and as we're moving it around, we're actually spreading those invasive plants. So that's another economic impact. It's going to take longer for us to take care of that. So this might be a familiar sight to some of you. You can see the bush honeysuckle growing along this trail. I know I personally wouldn't want to walk on this trail because it's pretty likely that you're going to get scratched by some of those plants. It doesn't look very pretty. So we're going to talk a little bit about why this is problematic. So we're going to talk about some ticks. Luckily, I haven't gotten any ticks yet this season. Usually I get at least 10 by now, but since I haven't been working outside, I haven't gotten any ticks. So we're going to talk a little bit about how ticks can basically, they work in harmony with bush honeysuckle. So the tick that we're looking at, the one in the middle of the screen there, is the Lone Star tick. And it has basically adapted to like to hang out on bush honeysuckle. So as I mentioned before, bush honeysuckle is the first plant to get its leaves in the spring. It's also the last plant to keep its leaves in the fall. And so if you're looking at the tick life cycle over there, when a tick is in the larvae stage, it needs to have a blood meal. So it needs to attach to a mammal in order to move to the next stage of life. Whenever Lone Star ticks are in that larvae cycle, that's usually in October and November. So what plant still has leaves in October and November? Bush honeysuckle. Also, deer like to bed down in bush honeysuckle because it keeps its leaves longer. So the ticks have basically realized if I'm going to try to latch onto a deer, I should probably find a plant that a deer is more likely to be in. So they've adapted to figure out that if I sit on the leaves of bush honeysuckle, then I'm more likely to latch onto a deer. So you can see in the bottom, that's a questing tick. So if I've never seen one in person, I've only seen pictures, but ticks have these like little arms that they stick out like this, and they have basically they can sense whenever a mammal is about to walk by. And if you've ever seen the leaf of a bush honeysuckle, it has like a perfect teardrop tip, and it's a great leaf if you're a questing tick because there's a lot of room to sit. So they're able to sit on the edge of that leaf, kind of wait with their arms up until someone, maybe you, walk down this trail or a deer, and they're able to latch onto you. So long story short, in order to help to reduce the amount of humans that are infected with tick-borne illness like Lyme disease, we can remove bush honeysuckle. Here are some helpful tips to avoid ticks. Wearing light-colored long-sleeve shirts are generally a good idea so that you can see the tick. I know I used to have dark brown field work pants, and I quickly realized that was a bad choice because then I can't see the ticks crawling on me. So now I prefer like a white gray pant so that I can see them crawling. Like I said, they're usually present close to the ground level. So if you tuck your pants into your socks or your boots, they're less likely to get down underneath your pants. If you feel comfortable using an insect repellent, you can do that. And then just make sure that you're checking yourself as you're working outside, especially if you're working in bush honeysuckle. Make sure you're taking a hot shower and looking again. And then of course, remove bush honeysuckle plants and replace with natives. And lastly, this is a pretty easy one. Most of us who enjoy being outside in nature are going out so that we can see wildlife, so that we can see lots of beautiful native plants and trees. And so if we continue to let invasive plants take hold in these areas, we're less likely to enjoy nature. Additionally, places like state parks and maybe MDC are using up a lot of their budget in order to treat invasive plant infestations rather than using that budget on maybe upgraded bathrooms or a more accessible parking lot, or maybe boot brush stations at the top of their trailhead. So really the more work that we do on this, the less money it's going to cost over time, and then we can use some of that to improve these recreational areas. Any questions so far on those before we move on to the next thing?
I like this little picture of this bird.
All right. So we're going to stick with bush honeysuckle because it's the perfect native plant, or sorry, it's not native, the perfect invasive plant to hit all the reasons why we should remove them. So a common misconception, fruits of all exotic landscaping shrubs are good for birds and wildlife, right? Look at this happy bird. It's eating that berry and it looks like it's having a good tasty treat. However, most of the worst invasive shrubs in the United States, like bush honeysuckle, produce fruits that are that have poor nutritional value compared to native plant shrubs. So as the bird eats the berries, they're going to disperse them, which basically helps the seeds spread further than they would have if they just dropped onto the ground. So thinking about bush honeysuckle berries specifically, they actually are really high in carbohydrates, and so it's not something that is helpful for birds, especially birds that are migrating. It doesn't provide any nutritional value to them. Additionally, bush honeysuckle berries have a somewhat laxative effect on birds, and so they actually only stay inside of the bird for 20 minutes before they disperse them flying off. So if you think about this one bird eating all those berries from that shrub and then flying away, you can just see those tiny little honeysuckle plants popping up every place that that bird disperses. So here's a helpful picture. So basically the fruits of honeysuckle are like eating M&Ms before you go work out or doing yard work, where using native plants actually have high desirable fats which birds need. So a little fun comparison. So other ways that seeds can spread, they can stick to your hiking boots and your clothes, your camping gear. This picture at the bottom is actually me after a super fun hiking trip in Wyoming. And when I got to the bottom of the trail, I saw the boot brush station, and I was really, really, really excited about it because I wanted to make sure that as I'm heading back to where I was living in Illinois, that I wasn't taking those seeds with me back to where I was going. So some solutions, making sure that they're not stuck to your clothes or gear. If you're driving your vehicle through an area that's with or that's highly infested with invasive plants, you want to make sure that you wash that off using a boot brush station or a boot brush after you're done hiking, and then trying to avoid those areas that are highly infested.
Alli?
Yeah.
We have a quick question from the audience.
Yes.
What controls honeysuckle in its native area?
This is a really good question. Actually, a lot of some of the invasive plants that we're dealing with in this region are actually plants that are native to the same region, which is in the Amur River Valley. It's in right on the border of Europe and Asia, but it has a very similar climate to what we have here in the Midwest. So those plants are able to thrive there, being eaten by those wildlife, and they're actually other plants that can outcompete the invasive ones in their natural habitat, but those plants are not present here in the Midwest. So there's other native plants and wildlife that keep it in check in the Amur River Valley, where they all come from, but once we bring them over, then we kind of start losing that battle. And then one more kind of way that they spread. This might be a familiar sight to you if you've ever seen those right-of-ways being mowed. If you think about if there are invasive plants on those right-of-ways on the sides of the highway, this tractor with a mower attachment is driving all the way down 44, and then it's getting off, and now it's going to go drive down 55 south. And so all those plants that were present on 44 are now stuck inside of the mower attachment, And when we take that mower attachment to a new spot, then we're dispersing those seeds. So making sure that we're cleaning those equipment off every single time we're done using them so that we can try to keep the plants in check in one spot rather than spreading them all over the place. If you do own like a boat or a jet ski and you take it into a body of water, you want to make sure that you're draining and cleaning your boat before going into a different body of water. We're not going to talk too much about aquatic invasive species today because that's kind of a whole different topic, but that's a huge way that invasive plants and animals are being spread in waterways. And then another great option is to plant native gardens instead of grass so that you don't have to mow it. All right, so now we're going to talk about some invasive plant myths and facts. So some people think that invasive plants aren't really a concern in the Midwest. They're more of a problem in places like California and Florida. You see pictures of kudzu taking over utility poles and growing on houses, but really they're all over the place. So this is a map of the United States and where bush honeysuckle is found, and you can see that it's present all over the place. And again, this map is only as accurate as we are reporting it. So there's obviously there's more cases. You can see that little white section on the tip of Illinois there. Obviously there's bush honeysuckle in those counties. We just haven't had any people reporting those invasive plants. So at the end of the presentation, we'll go over how you can report invasive plants when you find them. Another myth is that species move around and expand naturally. So when we introduce a new species, it's no different than natural selection. They would get here eventually. But the truth is that we're moving species at a much faster rate than ever. We have lots of different horticultural varieties of different plants that are able to crossbreed and create new hybrid species that we never thought were possible. And all of this is great science, you know, for if you're looking to have the most beautiful green shrub with the most beautiful pink leaves, you can do lots of things to get that outcome. But we need to make sure that we're not bombarding our ecosystem with all of these different new varieties. We should also make sure that we're not introducing any more exotic species into our natural environment. We should be really focusing on cultivating those plants that we know to be native and beneficial to our area. Another myth, all non-native species are bad. This is obviously not true. A lot of our non-native species are very beneficial for agriculture, horticulture, medicine. A lot of the food that we eat is obviously not native to this region, but we're able to grow it here anyway. So not all non-native species are bad, but it's hard to know when a new species is going to be invasive when we introduce it. So we should really use caution introducing any new species. All right, cutting, hand pulling, and mowing are the best ways to control invasive species. We're going to get into this a little bit in the next few slides. This can be true. There are lots of different ways to control lots of different types of plants. So there's no one-size-fits-all method to removing invasive plants. Often it takes a combination of these different things in order to achieve total eradication of that plant in one area. However, there's two different examples shown in these pictures. The top picture is garlic mustard, which we're gonna see some pictures of later. But this is a biennial species, which means that it only lives for 2 years. In the first year, it lives as a rosette, kind of like as a ground cover. And then in the second year, it's able to grow a flowering stalk that has seeds. And actually one plant can have up to 900 seeds. And those seeds are viable in the seed bank for up to 5 years. So if we're able to hand pull all of these plants that are in their second year of growth before they go to seed, you can do a lot of control that way. However, if we mow these whenever they're in seed production, then we're going to spread those seeds everywhere. So you have to just know which way is the best way to control the plant based on what stage of life it's in. So if it's a rosette, maybe mowing it would be a good idea. But if it has seeds, then mowing is probably not the best choice. The bottom picture is bush honeysuckle. And so this is a plant that has been cut in the past, but maybe wasn't treated with herbicide or obviously wasn't removed completely by the roots. And you can see all those tiny little sprouts coming back up in the second year once it's been removed. This is the one that I hear the most. I live in an urban area, so it doesn't matter if I have invasive species, they're not going to spread from my yard. So you can see this picture is a tree called Tree of Heaven that's actually growing out of concrete. So just because you live in an urban area doesn't mean that that invasive plants can't and won't spread from your yard. If you think about the ways that we talked about invasive plants spreading earlier, so birds are eating those seeds. As you're washing maybe your sidewalk off, you're washing those seeds into the storm drains, which are carried to creeks, and then those seeds are dispersed by water. Seeds are dispersed by wind. So there's lots of different ways that these are going to take hold, whether you think that you're doing any damage or not. So the best way to prevent the spread is to remove them and not plant them in the first place. So going along with that, thought of, well, I live in an urban area, so it doesn't matter if I have bush honeysuckle. This might be a common picture that we see in lots of different suburban areas in the St. Louis region. People use bush honeysuckle as a privacy hedge, a very inexpensive fence, basically. So I would remove it, but I need it for a privacy hedge between my yard and my neighbor's yard. This isn't a good excuse because there are so many other plants that grow in the same way that bush honeysuckle does that have really great benefits to our native wildlife. So here are some examples of those. You could plant buttonbush. You could plant Ozark witch hazel or downy serviceberry. One of my favorites, red buckeye, or spicebush. So you'll see that all of these plants kind of grow in that tall, shrubby kind of form. So they're going to give you the same privacy hedge that bush honeysuckle would, but these are going to be way more beneficial to our native wildlife. And you're going to be really promoting biodiversity in your yard. You could do a mix. You could plant lots of different kinds of shrubs that all have the same kind of growth so that you don't have to see maybe your chain link fence in your neighbor's yard, or so that you can have a little more privacy for your patio. But there are a lot of different native plants that you could choose instead. So I'll send these links to Andrea to send out to you. But all of these plants can be found on our website. We have an article called Native Alternatives for Bush Honeysuckle and Other Shrubs. So I only highlighted a few, but there are lots of different options. Whether you're looking for a shaded area or full sun area or a really wet area, somewhere very dry, there are a lot of options. So here's a good case study, a local case study actually. So Margie and Dan Terpstra are longtime Kirkwood, Missouri residents. They own just a half acre in Kirkwood, Missouri, and you can see what they've been able to complete in their backyard by following their blog. But you can see in the left picture there, this is when they, before they started really transforming their backyard, but that's completely infested with bush honeysuckle and other invasive species. And this is what they were able to accomplish afterwards. So they have a high level of diversity in their yard. They've also put in some water features as well as some butterfly gardens. And I have some more information. So by removing their invasive species and replanting with natives, they've been able to provide an oasis for over 145 different bird species, including 35 different species of warblers. So if you're someone who is really interested in birds and birding and figuring out what kind of plants are best for different types of birds, you could really focus on choosing those plants. So if you look up, there are lots of different resources which I can send to Andrea on figuring out which keystone species are necessary for different bird species. So if you look up, I really want to have this type of warbler in my backyard, maybe I should plant this plant. So instead of just letting invasive plants run wild, you could really choose some beneficial native plants, and it's very aesthetically pleasing. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about control methods. Are there any other questions, Andrea?
You know what, real quick, Allie, Cliff
Yeah.
asked about the time period of the transition. Cliff, are you referring to like the before and after of these photos?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly the time between these. You can take a look at their blog. I think the invasive plant removal part probably took a few years, and then getting these plants established probably took a little bit longer. Especially you can tell in this after picture that soil looks really fresh. So those are probably right when those plants were established. But it would be cool to see what kind of plants have volunteered or how those plants have matured since they installed them.
Right.
But I recommend going to their blog and taking a look around.
That tree on the right, that looks like it should have been in this left picture, but I don't know if I see it.
Yeah, this might be from a different angle. I'm not sure if this is exactly the same, the same spot it was taken, but regardless, they were able to remove a lot of the invasive plants on their property and replace them with these natives. You'll also notice in this picture on the right here that they still have grass. So they're able to still have some lawn while also making room for native plant species. A lot of people think, oh, well, I have to convert my whole yard at one time. I don't recommend doing that. I have just a little tiny patch of native plants in my backyard, and the rest of it is grass. But you need to think about how you want to use your property. So if having grass is something that you need, that's fine. Just try to find one spot or even one bed that you could plant some native plants, and it doesn't have to be all at once, and you don't have to do a ton at a time. Okay, so thinking about control methods, we were talking about in that graph on the economic impact slide about being able to detect those plants as they're established and remove them immediately. So this method is called early detection rapid response. Basically, you're able to identify the plant as it starts to invade, and you're able to get rid of it pretty quickly. So this is the most effective control method. Integrated pest management is kind of what I was discussing earlier about how we might have to use several different management strategies to achieve our goals. So we might start by mowing or by removing invasive trees with a chainsaw. Then we might follow it up with some herbicide. And then maybe in a few years, we might do a prescribed fire. So one method isn't going to work for you every single time. You might have to use a combination of these methods in different times of the year. So your method that you use in the spring might not be the same one you use in the fall. So this is just a disclaimer about herbicide. I'm going to talk about herbicide because it is a very useful tool, but we do recognize that it can be potentially very harmful if used in a way that's inconsistent with the label. So if you do plan to use herbicide, you need to make sure that you're wearing personal protective equipment and that you're following all label instructions so that you're not, causing harm to nearby plants, waterways, animals, wildlife, that kind of thing. All right. So now the next portion, if you had the guide that Andrea sent out in the email, it does have a list of these 20 plants on it. So you do have this list. So don't feel like you need to write down every single plant. I am going to go over 20 plants that are commonly found in Missouri and Illinois that are invasive. This is not an all-inclusive list. There are over 150 invasive species in Missouri, and we don't have time to go over all of them today. So this is just kind of the most common invasive plants that you might find in your own backyard. And we're also going to talk a little bit about control methods for each plant. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on each plant, so if you have questions about a specific plant, my email address is in the email that Andrea sent, as well as at the end of the presentation, so feel free to send me pictures or ask questions about specific plants after this. So here are some of the invasive trees that we're going to go over. The first one is the Callery pear or the Bradford pear. There's a million different names for it. It might be the aristocrat pear or the, I don't know, there's tons and tons of different names for it, but it's all the same thing. So the Callery pear is our #1 tree. Tree of heaven silk tree or mimosa, the golden rain tree, or the Siberian elm. Those are our 5 trees we'll discuss. Invasive shrubs, we're gonna really keep on hitting it hard with bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, border privet, burning bush, and multiflora rose. As far as vines go, we're gonna talk about winter creeper, Japanese honeysuckle, oriental bittersweet, kudzu, and English ivy. And then this is kind of the miscellaneous category, but we're going to talk about some different forbs and grasses. So garlic mustard, we briefly mentioned already, spotted knapweed, Sericea lespedeza, Johnson grass, and thistles. So the first one is calorie pear. I would love to see in the chat if anybody has any calorie pears in their backyard, or maybe if your neighbor does. I know when I sit on my back porch, my neighbor has a very large, mature calorie pear tree in their backyard. And just a few weeks ago, you probably saw those in peak bloom. You know, people love these trees, and they were introduced because they have a very beautiful growth form. They have these beautiful white flowers. I can't deny that they're a very attractive tree. However, this was kind of a horticulture experiment gone wrong. So without spending too much time on it, basically what happened is that horticulturists were looking at modifying this plant to make it the most favorable. So they really wanted this kind of teardrop shaped canopy, and they wanted it to have a really straight trunk, and they wanted it to have really beautiful leaves and flowers. So they actually grafted a rootstock from a calorie pear with a different type of Bradford pear. So they were able to grow those together in one form. They were supposed to be a sterile tree. So they were basically genetically modified so that they wouldn't produce fruits. When you basically graft 2 trees together, they have 2 different genetic makeups, right? So as these 2 plants are growing together on top of each other, they're actually able to crossbreed and produce fruit. So that's the fruit that you see in the top corner there is the fruit of the Bradford calorie pear, basically combo. So this was obviously not an intended outcome. They wanted this to be a great like landscape tree. You see them in new subdivisions popping up because they're cheap. Another reason that we don't recommend these is because they don't have a central leading trunk, which means that they have lots of tiny trunks coming out from one main point at the bottom, which, as you've probably seen before, if there's a lot of wind or a lightning storm, they're likely to crack. So this is not a good investment. It's not a beneficial tree. It doesn't support any species that are native to Missouri, and it's really just a nuisance. The next one is Tree of Heaven. This one is kind of one that pops up in kind of natural areas, right-of-ways. This isn't one that's being sold. It's not particularly like, I don't know, it's not a tree that is highly desirable. People aren't trying to plant this. But this is just one that pops up. It starts out pretty small, but it can actually grow really, really fast. Given the name Tree of Heaven, it can grow to heaven pretty quickly. One way that I can identify this pretty easily is that if you crush up the leaves in your hand and you smell them, it smells like peanut butter. And then another way you can think about it is if you cut the twig open, the inside, the pith of the stem actually looks a little bit like peanut butter. So I think of this as the peanut butter tree. And if you ever see one, you'll, as soon as you smell it and you get it on your hands, you're never gonna forget the smell. This one can be easily mistaken for like our native sumacs because it has a compound, pinnately compound leaf, meaning that the leaves are growing across from each other, kind of in an opposite arrangement. So you want to make sure that you're correctly identifying these species before you start removing them so that you're not accidentally cutting down a native tree instead. Mimosa was a plant, as you could probably tell, that was introduced as a landscape tree for its beautiful growth form. It has these kind of feathery fern looking leaves with these beautiful pink flowers. And so this is just another one that pops up. Once someone has it in their backyard, you're going to find little saplings growing all around it. It does have those long seed pods too, so that's another way to tell it apart. The golden rain tree is one that hasn't really taken hold in Missouri yet, but it's one that should be on your watch list. So this is a plant that is sold as a landscape tree. It's actually recommended on several, horticulture sites because it's a pretty sturdy tree, but it also has the potential to be invasive. So if you're thinking about buying one of these, don't try to choose a native tree instead. And then the last tree we're going to discuss is Siberian elm. This is also not a tree that anybody is selling or anyone is buying. This is just one that pops up. You can see, I get this one in my backyard all the time. It's kind of growing in like a rocky bed on the side of someone's driveway. So you'll probably see these popping up pretty soon in the next few weeks. And that picture there is, it's the fruit that it produces in the middle. So how do we get rid of invasive trees? In small areas, a lot of these trees can just be pulled up by the roots, especially if it's just rained and the soil's pretty moist. You can just pull it right out. If it's a medium or large tree, you should try to cut it down as low as you can, and then you should treat it with herbicide to prevent it from resprouting. There are some different effective herbicides that you can use, but glyphosate will be a good option, or triclopyr, using those at a 25 or 50% solution. And then some less labor-intensive options. There's a method of applying herbicide called basil bark, where you combine an herbicide with an oil-based solution. So you basically paint it around the circumference of the tree, kind of at like the breast height level, and it will actually start to soak into the cambium of the tree through the bark, and then it'll get sucked down into the roots. So basically this one kills it from the bottom up, but it'll leave a standing dead tree. So if you do choose to remove a tree by using the basil bark option, as soon as you can tell that it's dead, you should probably try to remove it, as it's going to be a hazard if you leave it up.
Alli, real quick question.
Yeah.
Are the herbicides dangerous for pets?
That's a good question. There's a lot of unknowns on these herbicides, as they're pretty new to the market. So I would say use extreme caution using them around pets. I personally don't use a ton of herbicide in my own yard, but if I was going to, I would make sure that that herbicide fully soaks in before I let my pets around it. And usually it can soak into the plants within a few hours, so it shouldn't be a huge issue. Although you definitely don't want to apply herbicide if there's a chance of rain in the forecast, because a lot of these herbicides are water-based. So if we apply herbicide and then it rains, that rainwater is going to wash it off, and it can soak into our soils. So you definitely want to be careful using herbicide. Definitely read all the instructions on the label before you do so. So here's some native lookalikes. I said earlier that you want to make sure that you have the right plant before you cut it down. So if you have what you think might be a calorie pair, you want to also check to make sure it's not any of these native species first. I'll talk about this later in the presentation, but if you've never used the app iNaturalist before, it's a great way to identify plants in your backyard. And generally it'll give you a list of what plants it thinks that it might be. And then it'll give you some pictures of maybe its leaves or its flowers or its bark, so you can be really sure that you have the right plant. Okay, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because we've really talked a lot about bush honeysuckle already, but it has those teardrop shaped leaves. In the fall, it's going to get those bright red berries. And then in the spring, it's going to have kind of whitish yellow flowers, and those will be popping up here pretty soon. Generally it grows, it has one kind of mass at the bottom, and it grows up in like a fountain shape. And then it has really striped bark. So you're able to really, once you see it, you can't unsee it, unfortunately. So once you learn to identify bush honeysuckle, you're going to see it everywhere. Excuse me. The next plant we're going to talk about is autumn olive. This one is a plant that I haven't seen too much here in Missouri, but I'm originally from Illinois, in Jerseyville, Illinois, if anyone is familiar with the Alton, Illinois area. So whenever I drive home to see my parents, I go on 255 and I see this along 255. So that's the only place I've seen it so far. It's definitely other places, but that's the one place I've seen it really taking hold. So unlike the bush honeysuckle, where it has kind of one central stump with lots of leaders growing out of it, this one has lots and lots of tiny sprouts. So this picture that you see in the top left, where it looks like one big shrub, that's actually lots of tiny little plants that are all growing together in one clump. So this one is pretty labor intensive to remove by cutting, because you really have to make sure you get every single stem. A way that you can identify it is it has kind of these rusty spots on the bark. You can kind of see in that picture. Those are called lenticels, the little dots on the stems, but it has kind of a rusty color. And then the leaves themselves look pretty green on one side, but then on the other side, it's kind of silvery, like almost metallic. So you can see that from far away as the sun reflects off of those leaves. The next one we're going to talk about is privet. If anybody has spent any time out at Shaw Nature Reserve, this is one that we're constantly battling out there in the forested areas. As you might know, Shaw Nature Reserve was an arboretum before it became a nature reserve, and so we introduced a lot of different species at Shaw because it's basically a tree museum. So these plant species came from all over the world. But we know now that after we introduce all those plants, there's potential for them to spread. So likely the reason that we have a lot of privet out at Shaw Nature Reserve is because it was introduced when it was an arboretum. So we're working on removing this all the time. There are work days out there on Mondays, Thursdays, and Saturdays that other volunteers like you are removing invasive species all the time. So this is the one we primarily focus on out there next to bush honeysuckle. But it grows in kind of a similar way. It just takes over the full understory. So you can see in that top picture there, all of that is privet. It has these kind of like black purple berries that hang on into the winter. And then in the spring, it gets these kind of whitish flowers. The next one we're going to talk about is burning bush. And this one is often kind of a shock to people that this is actually an invasive species. Because the garden actually used to have lots of burning bushes right at the entryway. So we've since gotten rid of those and replanted with other species. But you can see that picture kind of in the middle on the bottom there is what it looks like when it takes hold in an understory area in a forested region. So obviously it gets these kind of bright red leaves in the fall. So you can see what it looks like when it kind of takes over. But some ways to identify it when it doesn't have bright red leaves is that it has ridges on the stems that kind of look like corky. So it has almost like a box shape if you were to cut a cross section of it. It also gets kind of red fruits in the fall. The last shrub that we're going to talk about is also kind of a vine too. It grows in a few different forms. But this is multiflora rose, and this is just another invasive kind of shrub. It has lots of thorns on it, so if you find it, you might notice, because hopefully you don't get any thorns in you, but I've definitely experienced that before. It has a white rose flower. It's in the same family as some of our native roses, and then it does get kind of those red rose hips later on in the year. So similar ways to control shrubs to the ways that we control trees. Again, if the soil is moist, a lot of these have a pretty shallow root system that you can just pop them right out of the ground. Smaller infestations can be treated. There are some different ways that you can use prescribed burning. However, that's a non-selective method. So if you're going to do a prescribed burn, you want to make sure that there aren't plants around there that you're going to negatively impact. Also, realize that prescribed burning only kills the plants from the top, so the roots will still survive after a burn. It can definitely cut back new growth, especially new saplings in their first year. But if you're trying to remove 30-year-old bush honeysuckle, probably fire isn't the best option. One of the ways that we most commonly remove some of these shrubs are cutting it at the base. So you want to cut it down as low to the ground as you can, using sharp tools, so maybe brush cutters, a chainsaw, some loppers, things like that. And then generally we apply a 20% solution of glyphosate and you're going to apply that to the cut stump. And you need to do that pretty much immediately because the same way that if we get a cut on our arm, our skin automatically creates a scab or a cuticle over that cut. Plants do the same thing. So if you cut a plant and you wait 3 days, it's probably already gotten a cuticle over it. And if you apply herbicide later, then it's not going to be effective. It's not going to absorb into that stem. You can also foliar spray a lot of these, so using a backpack sprayer. However, you want to make sure that you're using a more diluted solution. So the recommendation for cut stump is 20%, but if you're going to do a backpack application, it should be like 2% or maybe 1% because it's such, you're broadcast spraying it, so you don't want to have, you don't want it to be as potent just in case it does get on neighboring plants. So some native lookalikes, bush honeysuckle. We do have some native honeysuckles, so that can be confusing. They don't look alike, but sometimes people see the name honeysuckle and then they think it's invasive, but there are some native ones. We do have a native burning bush called Eastern Wahoo. Honestly, it looks very, very similar, and it has the same benefits as far as the red color in the growth form as the invasive burning bush. So if you do have burning bush in your yard, consider replanting with this. You might not even tell the difference. And then we do have some native roses. Okay, we're gonna go over some vines. I'm gonna keep going through this pretty quickly. Winter creeper is one that's kind of growing all over the place in Missouri. It starts as a ground cover and then it eventually grows up the trunks of trees. Once it grows tall enough, it starts to produce these fruits that you see in the top picture there. So you can see that some of them are white and some of them are red. They have these capsules that start out white, and then as they start to expand, then the capsules break open to reveal the red fruit. We have a viney version of honeysuckle. So a lot of people remember as a kid taking the flowers off of these and kind of sucking the nectar out of them. So whenever we talk about bush honeysuckle, a lot of people think of this plant, but they are different. They're in the same genus, so they're related, but they grow in totally different ways. So the Japanese honeysuckle is a very skinny vine that can trail all over the place. So often you might actually see Japanese honeysuckle growing on top of bush honeysuckle because they kind of work together that way. The next vine we're going to talk about is Chinese or Oriental bittersweet. So this is just another plant that starts as a ground cover, eventually grows up the trees, and then it has those the same kind of capsules as the winter creeper, where it starts out as like an orangey yellow capsule to reveal a red fruit. A fun fact about this one, it was actually introduced through craft stores because people thought that the berries were really beautiful and wanted to put them on wreaths. Well, when they put them on the wreaths outside their doors, then birds started to see the berries, they came by and ate the berries, and then they started dispersing the plant. So we talk about different ways that plants are introduced, usually through horticulture industry or through packing materials, things like that, but there are other ways that plants can be introduced. So think about that too. Whenever you're buying dried plant material, you want to make sure that you're choosing native plant material for that too. Kudzu is one that we see primarily in the southern United States. It's a pretty detrimental invasive vine. It can take down a house, it can take down utility poles, but it's really, really, it can really take hold very quickly. We do have a little bit of it in the Midwest, but it's definitely one to watch out for. The last one is English ivy. This is another one that was introduced as a landscape plant to kind of cover the ground in landscaped areas around people's homes. But again, it became invasive because it has these fruits that are eaten by the birds and then carried off. So consider removing your English ivy if you have any at your house, and there are lots of other native ground covers you can choose to replace with. So invasive vines are a little bit harder to control, mostly because it's hard to find where they start and where they end. So a good way to remove it is to try to pull them out. And then if you feel comfortable using herbicide, you want to actually treat both sides. So let's say I cut a section of the vine out, I'm going to treat both ends, even if this is maybe not the beginning or the end, because I have a better chance of controlling them, rather if I only treat one side, like I would in a shrub. You can use a foliar application with glyphosate. So again, that backpack sprayer, but with a lot of these plants, they have a very glossy leaf. So you want to make sure you're using a surfactant, which is basically just something that helps the chemical stick to the leaf. Otherwise, it's going to kind of run right off and then onto the soil and may not actually do anything to the plant. Again, if they're too large for hand pulling, you can cut them at the base, try to treat them with herbicide, and then repeat treat every season. So some native lookalikes, we do have some native honeysuckle vines. Those actually have red flowers rather than the white and yellow ones, so it should be easy to tell those apart. And then we do have an American bittersweet that looks almost exactly like the Oriental bittersweet. Other than that, the capsule that surrounds the fruit is more yellow than orange. Okay, last 5. We talked about garlic mustard a lot already whenever we were talking about pulling and mowing and the different treatments. I mentioned that they do get a flowering stalk. You can see in that bottom right picture there with the white flowers on the top, all of those kind of little stem looking things that hang off of that, those are all seed capsules. So like I said, they have as many as 7,000 seeds. Most have at least 900. And then they're able to stay in the seed bank for up to 5 years. Spotted knapweed is one of those that's on our noxious weed list, and this one is more of a problem in kind of like old fields or agriculture areas growing along the sides of crops. You can kind of see what it looks like in their growth form down there, but this is another one that starts as a rosette, so it just grows as a ground cover, and then the next year it grows a flower. Sericea lespedeza is a huge invasive plant in prairie ecosystems. So this is one that once it gets hold, it can really spread very quickly. So it has kind of the easy to tell legume like leaf. So it has that leaf that has 3 little leaflets on it that grows mostly kind of in a spike. And then it does get those yellow flowers followed by those kind of fuzzy seeds later in the year. This is an invasive grass, but this is Johnson grass. The best way to identify this is that it's one of the only grasses that has this white vein going down the middle of the leaf. So if you see that white vein, you know it's Johnson grass, but it can kind of resemble corn, or it grows really tall, so people think that it looks a little bit like that. And lastly, thistles. We have lots of different species of thistles. Almost every single thistle is invasive. So if you find one, it's probably not one that we want. I think there might be 1 or 2 native thistles to Missouri, but everything else is invasive. Again, this is another one that starts as a rosette, and then in the second year it grows flowers. And then those flowers give way to this kind of fuzzy seed that looks a little like puffy. And that's wind dispersed.
Guys, we've gotten through them all. I can't believe it.
All 20.
Allie, is it time to distribute the test to everyone? JK. Look, everyone's laughing, they know.
So again, as this is kind of the miscellaneous category, there's a lot of different ways to control these, but mowing or hand pulling, a lot of these methods are the same. There are some native lookalikes, some different native grasses. Switchgrass and Indian grass can sometimes resemble Johnson grass. And then bush clover can sometimes resemble Sericea lespedeza. Okay, we've made it to the end. I'm just going to go over some quick resources that might be helpful to you. So the first one is the Invasive Plant Task Force. I mentioned at the beginning that we're not currently adding any new plants to the noxious weed list. However, we're working on a cease the sale act that we're going to try to get passed. But basically, we want to create a list of invasive species that would be illegal for landscape nurseries to sell. So this is a group of people that work statewide to control invasive plants. And I'm on this kind of task force group. And so we meet quarterly, and we're working with stakeholder groups to make sure that we're working in unison with all the different stakeholders in Missouri so that we can come together and have a better chance of getting this passed. One of the ways that we're working on getting that approach passed is by creating these heat maps. So we asked 26 field biologists to rate 142 different species of invasive plants based on their impact, their abundance, and their trend. From those results, we created these heat maps that you can see on this slide. So all of these maps are available to you on our website. If you're interested in seeing where the different species occur in Missouri and where they're likely to spread, this is a good place to look. And again, I'll send these links to Andrea, but you can find it on our website, moinvasives.org. And then there's this little section here that says browse 152 maps. You can search for plants or you can scroll through and see them. This is just a little reminder to do your research before you start planting. Both of these are documents or pamphlets that are distributed to St. Louis residents on a regular basis. These are plants that are recommended that people plant in their yard. However, there are some invasive plants on these lists. In a lot of cases, these are just outdated. They just haven't been updated in a long time. And so maybe they didn't know that these plants were invasive when they first distributed these pamphlets. But a good place to look to see if plants are invasive is the Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder. So you can type in species. You've probably all used Plant Finder before. But you might not have known that there's a little warning if it's a locally invasive species. So if you're looking to plant a new tree or a shrub, throw it into Plant Finder and see what the results say before you start to plant things. Also, our native plants on Plant Finder say that they're native to Missouri. Another great resource is MDC. They have these different guides for lots of different invasive species. So if you're looking to control a specific species, take a look to see if they have a specific guide for that. That will give you herbicide information, control methods. It'll give you different plants that you can replace those invasive plants with. It's really just a great resource. If you're looking for native plants or for contractors that will install native plants for you, head over to Grow Native. They have a resource guide that they put out every year that has a list of places that you can buy native plants in Missouri. I think they also have some in Illinois too, kind of in the metro area. So these are nurseries that sell native plants as well as contractors that do work to promote native species. They also do webinars kind of like this, and they also do lots of plant sales. So just all around a good resource. I talked about reporting invasive species earlier in the presentation. So if you do find invasive species, you can go to EdMaps. They also have an app, but you can take a picture and it'll use your location to report that invasive species. And basically this just helps landowners have a better idea of where the invasive species are located in our region. So if you're somebody that already likes to take pictures of plants and learn more about them, this is a great way for you to contribute to some really great research. I talked about iNaturalist too, but iNaturalist is a great app for all things. So it will help you identify plants, excuse me, animals, birds, fungi, tracks, nests, all kinds of things. And a quick plug, the City Nature Challenge is this weekend. So if you're out in your backyard taking pictures, if you upload your observations to iNaturalist between 12:01 a.m. on Friday and 11:59 p.m. on Monday, your observations will count toward the City Nature Challenge. And if you want more information about that, I will put the link in the email that Andrea will send out. But we have a Facebook page and a Facebook event, so head over there for some really great virtual content. Lastly, for bush honeysuckle resources, our website has a lot more information, but each spring and fall we do a honeysuckle sweep for healthy habitats. Unfortunately, our March one got a little derailed by COVID-19, but hopefully we'll come back strong in the fall. But public places host removal events. So volunteers come and help to remove invasive bush honeysuckle to help out these public lands that just don't have the capacity to have staff remove invasive plants. We also have an awesome brochure called Get Rid of It that's available on our website too. So if you know anyone that has honeysuckle, you could give them a pamphlet and tell them why they should get rid of it. Okay, so that's all I have. Sorry, I went a little bit over on time, but I'm happy to take any questions you might have.